In preparing for this sermon, I discovered that there is a National First Ladies Library and Museum in Canton, Ohio. And I'm indebted to them and their website, firstladies.org, for much of the information I'm going to share with you this morning. Who knew? If George Washington was the father of our country, then Martha Washington could be called the mother of our country, even though George and Martha never had any children together. In 1750, at the age of 19, Martha married Daniel Parke Custis. In 1751, she had a son, Daniel. She had a daughter named Frances in 1753. In 1754, she had a son named John. In that same year, Daniel died. In 1756, she had a daughter who she named after herself. In 1757, her husband and Francis died. In 1759, she married Colonel George Washington. In 1773, her daughter Martha died. In 1781, her last remaining child went to war, fighting in the same battle as General Washington, and he died. She and George raised his two children. When he became president, the children accompanied them to two Capitol mansions in New York and one Capitol mansion in Philadelphia. At the time, she was called Lady Washington. The title of First Lady had not been invented, and they never did live in the White House because the White House had yet to be built. But they raised children in what was then the Capitol. She preferred her privacy, but out of a sense of duty, she did hold formal dinners on Thursdays and receptions on Friday afternoons. But then for this, she was criticized as appearing too royal, and hadn't we just thrown off the shackles of royalty? I imagine the only peace she got was in Mount Vernon after her husband had died, that she had 3 years in which she outlived them. And her grandchildren had outlived her by more than 50, so she didn't have to face the tragedy of watching them die. But being a mother in the public eye, being a grandmother, is never easy. The role of motherhood is exhausting. And it's even more exhausting when your fate is tied to a workaholic with ambition. Such was John Quincy Adams, a Unitarian, son of President John Adams. He was a consummate politician, always wheeling and dealing. He was always looking for an angle. There was a time after his presidency when he served in Congress, and if you go on the Capitol tour, they'll show you where his desk was. And he was an old man at the time, and he used to pretend he was asleep. And what he could do, because he knew the way that the dome was shaped in the Capitol, that he could hear what the people of the other party were whispering. And so he would get what they were whispering about, and so he could make deals and figure out what their strategies were. He was always conniving. He had been sent over to London and as an ambassador early on in American history, and that's where he met his wife, Louisa Adams. And she was, to this date, the only first lady not born in the United States. And he continued to do these ambassadorships, occasionally coming back to the United States. Then he took a job in St. Petersburg and sent 2 of their 4 children to live with relatives in the States, so she could only take 2 of her children with her to St. Petersburg, and they stayed there for 8 years. And so she didn't see 2 of her children for 8 years as they lived in St. Petersburg. By the time she came to be First Lady, she really wasn't too familiar with American ways because they spent most of their time in Europe being ambassadors. And she did not enjoy her time in the White House. And it wasn't just because the social pressure. She had married into a very unruly clan. According to firstladies.org, they write, much of her anxiety during her White House tenure also stemmed from troubles involving the young people of her family. Her son George used opium to sleep and fathered an illegitimate child by a chambermaid. Her son John had been thrown out of Harvard. Her son Charles confessed to being addicted to depraved habits while at school at Harvard, using prostitutes at times. 2 nephews and nieces of her husband, the children of Thomas Adams, were often part of the household, seeking escape from their father's alcoholic tirades. Louisa Adams was also raising her late sister's 2 sons and daughters. One of her nephews left in charge of the White House while she and the rest of the family was vacationing, began an affair with a maid, and then ran off to marry her. Her niece, Mary Catherine, had a flirtatious affair with both of her cousins, Charles and George, before finally marrying their brother John in the White House on February 25th, 1828, the only time a presidential son was wed in the mansion. It was probably good that 24/7 news coverage had not been invented yet. But this might be the next hit series on HBO. Perhaps the most tragic mother in the White House was Mary Todd Lincoln. She arrived in 1861 with her husband and 3 sons, ages 7 to 17. A 4th son had died 10 years earlier at the age of 4. In the midst of the Civil War, she remodeled the White House. Her idea was to project Union confidence and strength and build the morale of the country. Instead, she was criticized for being extravagant in a time of war. And it was hard to remodel a house when Union soldiers were encamped at the White House, and the White House became a hospital, and she had to work as a volunteer nurse at the same time. And then in 1862, her 12-year-old son, Willie, died. And then riding through the rutted streets of Washington in 1863, she was thrown from a carriage and knocked unconscious. And then a couple years later, she finally had a break and she was able to go out to the theater. that did not end well. She moved to Germany in 1868 with her son Tad. When he died in 1871, she returned to the United States, where Robert, her only remaining son, had her declared insane and institutionalized. She did get out of the institution and spent the last days of her life living with her sister. This was a difficult term of being a mother. And the picture on your order of service is a portrait that was either painted or drawn at that time. I can't tell which. But I think it's so telling of the marriage. You have the husband looking in one direction, the wife looking in the other direction, and the children kind of faded in the background. That the idea that everybody was so concerned with their own trouble and that there was no way that this family could survive the pressures. And these 18th and 19th century mothers just showed how, in general, perilous that family life was. Child mortality was very common, and the death and disability of adult caretakers was also common. And children were often shuttled off to relatives, and women had little control of their lives. Their fortunes were tied to their husbands and social positions. The wealth that Martha Washington brought to her marriage belonged to George after they were married. By the middle of the late 19th century, during the Victorian era, Grover Cleveland became president. And he was a bachelor when he became president. 2 weeks after his inauguration, he turned 48. And he invited some friends to a White House party. One was a woman that was 3 years younger than him, 45, who was a widow. And she had high hopes of perhaps he would propose to her. But instead, he proposed to her 20-year-old daughter. In 1886, they were married. She was 21, Frances Folsom Cleveland. The press was fairly interested in their romance. So interested that they had to move out of the White House because people were pressing up against the gate and the White House was too public of a place. So they bought a 27-acre farm in the Georgetown section of Washington. He won the popular vote in 88, but he lost the Electoral College, and then he won it all again in 1892. And so they had 4 years off, and they returned to the White House with their baby Ruth, and baby Esther was born in that second term of the White House, followed soon by another daughter, Marion. And she had 3 more children after leaving the White House. And the 2 different terms were very different. The first term, she was a sensation and she was a scandal. Harper's Magazine put her on the cover often. The Women's Christian Temperance Union complained that she wore dresses that showed her bare shoulders. And so dresses with bare shoulders sold very well in the shops. She stopped wearing a bustle, heaven forbid. Saying American women stopped wearing bustles. And then the second term, she returned as a mother, and she became identified as a mother, and so she became the marketing on all sorts of projects of household goods, and And of course, no one asked her permission. They just took her image and slapped her on every type of soap and dishwashing detergent and everything. And they tried to pass a bill in Congress that you couldn't use any woman's form on a thing, but that didn't pass. It just made everything all the worse. And so there was just this kind of marketing thing that was thing. And then in the midst of all this, the country went into an economic depression, so then people were angry, and there was threats against the family that they would come and kidnap the family, and so they had to move out of the White House again to a more secure house to prevent kidnapping. During the midst of this, she realized while the public was watching her that she used her celebrity to advocate for the education of women, and including freed black women. So she provided some scholarships and promoted some schools, both her alma mater and schools that were aimed at educating women who had been freed from slavery and to help the education of those women. So in Frances Cleveland, we see the seeds of the modern First Lady. When Eleanor Roosevelt reached the White House, she was 48 years old. Her 5 children ranged from ages 22 to 32. The first part of her marriage was disrupted by her mother-in-law, who was critical of her and took over the child rearing. By the time they reached the White House, the marriage was more of a political partnership than an intimate relationship. The adult children had troubled lives while she and her husband solved the problems of the Great Depression and World War II. Political life completely overshadowed family life. And 100 years after Mary Todd Lincoln, Jackie Kennedy had a similarly tragic time. But it also contained that magic of Frances Cleveland. Young and good-looking, she was a celebrity. A young mother, her efforts to remodel the White House were praised instead of ridiculed like Lincoln's. However, she did have a miscarriage, and her husband was unfaithful. All was not perfect in their so-called Camelot. Her husband was shot, leaving her a widow with 2 small children. She was praised for her bravery and stoicism, and that helped a nation through this tragedy. But that bravery and stoicism never allowed her to truly grieve and take care of her own self. Her only refuge really was to marry a foreigner and leave the country for a while. Our current First Lady hired her husband. She was a professional, a Harvard graduate. He was looking for a job. They had parallel careers. She was a lawyer and was working for the University of Chicago, and he was a community organizer and then a politician. She eventually quit to assist him on his campaigns. When they entered the White House, their daughters were 7 and 10 years old. We as a nation have watched them grow over the past 8 years, mostly as they walk off of planes or standing at turkey pardonings, because the family has taken great pains to keep the press away from their children and make their children's lives as normal as possible. And she did invite her own mother to live in the White House to give the same no-nonsense day-to-day discipline as that Michelle received growing up on the south side of Chicago, while Michelle attended to her many duties as First Lady. And as First Lady, she chose child-focused activities, the Let's Move and the healthy gardening activities, which her children could participate, so that in fulfilling her first lady duties, she could also be doing activities with her children. And focusing on the childhood obesity has actually come down in the past few years, in contrast to other programs like Just Say No to Drugs didn't have really any effect on drug use in America. America sure has changed in the past 240 years. The First Lady owned slaves. The current First Lady descended from slaves. Martha Washington was educated informally at home. Michelle graduated with a law degree from Harvard Law School, which forbid women from attending until 1950. The nature of motherhood has changed because the nature of womanhood has changed. But one thing that has remained constant throughout this change is that no matter what a mother does, there is somebody who is standing on the outside ready to say that she is doing it wrong. And whoever is our next first spouse will be historic. If it's Jane Sanders, she has 3 grown children from a previous marriage and one stepchild from a previous liaison of Bernie's, and they're all grown, and so there's not really much mothering that goes on there. Melania Trump has a 10-year-old son. Of course, she will be criticized as a mother because she has posed and made her living by having a gorgeous body and a gorgeous face, and that's just not First Lady-like. And maybe perhaps for her choice of husband, but that's a matter of opinion. But that type of thing, and she would be the second foreign-born First Lady. And the other person wouldn't be a mother at all. Bill Clinton never has been and never will be a mother. And so that would be even a more unusual sense of how this nation has changed and how the role of women has changed. This idea of what is a perfect mother and how it should be represented in our highest and most sacred home in our country really speaks to who we think we are as a people and who we think this country should be and how families should be. And I think we're coming to a point where we realize that families aren't perfect. That if a marriage stays together for years, sometimes it stays together despite infidelities. Some marriages might be working even if it's the 3rd marriage. We don't know from the outside. What we need to do is have compassion on people and create policies that allow families to define themselves, to allow people to worship in ways that they see fit and not project what we think is a fit family and enshrine that in law and say, this is the only way you can worship. These are the genders you have to be. You cannot be divorced. You have to be virgins when you get married. You have to do this, and this. The more we try to regulate marriage and motherhood, the more it gets constricted and the more failure people feel. The reality is that we have to increase our mercy and make room for love. Because different people in different situations need to work, need to pray, need to express their emotions in different ways. Some families will have stay-at-home dads. Some families will have both parents working. Some families will have only one parent that's caring for that child. However it works, the children need to be cared for. Motherhood is about nurturing. It's about teaching right from wrong. It's not about the gender, the sexual orientation, the religion of the person. It's about caring. And we as a nation have to create the conditions for caring. The conditions for caring is how we can prepare all people to support motherhood and by extension support the children of this nation. May we bless and be blessed.